We're in George Washington University with Sarah Bender, who is a co-author of Politics or Principle, Filibustering in the United States Senate. To begin with, what is a filibuster? Where does that word come from?
Well, the word actually comes from the Dutch, from a word that I think they call freebooter when translated, which basically applied and meant pirates who were marauding across the seas and were unstoppable and basically killing everything in sight. And that's sort of the idea that filibustering senators can't be stopped. They can talk and talk until only a supermajority of the Senate can cut them off.
How did it start? Is there such a thing in the Constitution?
The Constitution says one thing about congressional rules. It says the House and Senate can set their own rules. Funny enough, the House and the Senate in 1789 basically had the same set of rules. It wasn't until early in the 1800s the Senate had a rule which the House has today. We call it the previous question motion. It's used to cut off debate by a majority vote. The Senate had it. It wasn't really using it. They didn't know how to use it. They get some advice to clean up the rule book, and out it goes. And once it's gone, there's no way for majority to cut off debate. I don't think the senators really understood what they were doing in 1806 when they cleaned up the rule book, but when filibusters start to heat up and partisanship heats up in 1830s, and the great senators that we talk about want to cut off debate, they can't, because there's no rule in the Senate rule book that allows a majority to cut off debate.
Now, couldn't they just change the rules?
Well, over time, senators have tried to change the rules. They have introduced rules to ban the filibuster. What happens when you introduce a rule to ban the filibuster? Somebody filibusters it. And so we have filibusters of efforts to change the filibuster. And that's essentially where we are today. There's a process for changing the filibuster, but it takes 67 votes. And we just got to 60 votes in the Senate of Senate Democrats, and still we don't have 67 votes to change the rules.
What are some of the earliest uses of the filibuster? What are some of the issues?
Well, we see filibusters start in earnest in late 1830s, 1840s, and they occur on the big and small issues of the day. We see them on the national bank, right? We see them on Andrew Jackson's behavior over the bank. We see them over who should be the printer of the United States Senate. We see them over slavery. We see them over extension of slavery into the territories, and of course we see them Civil War and beyond.
What were some of the earliest successful uses of filibuster?
Well, in each of these episodes, we see successes. We see minorities blocking the extension of slavery. We see battles in Kansas, Nebraska. We see battles between the Democrats and the Whigs over Andrew Jackson's and removing the deposits from the banks. It's pretty successful rather early on because the minority, if it's intense enough, can outlast the majority.
From what I've read, in 1917, there was some sort of a landmark event with Woodrow Wilson and World War I. What's that about?
Well, in the run-up to World War I, Woodrow Wilson is trying to get the Senate and the House to pass a bill that will allow them to arm merchant ships so that they wouldn't be attacked by the Germans in World War I. That bill is filibustered. 1915, there's a huge filibuster, and eventually Wilson goes public. He says, look, there's a ban of what he called willful men, a little ban of willful men, 11 senators blocking essentially the U.S. Arming itself for World War I. And he essentially shames the Senate to pass the bill, and then he calls the creation of the rule, basically we call Rule 22, the cloture rule. He says this is a war measure, right? We can't be a nation that can't go to war, and he induces a large supermajority of the Senate to create the cloture rule. That allows senators with a very high supermajority to cut off debate.
So as a scholar who studied this issue at that point, what's your opinion of that? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Or does that not enter into it for you?
The idea to get a cloture rule? Well, the Senate before then was essentially ungovernable, right? We look at today's Senate, we say, oh, this is terrible. It's never been so partisan, it's never been so petty. But if we look at the 19th century Senate, it was just as bad. Senators at least perceived it to be just as bad, and they had issues over civil rights, obviously, over anti-lynching laws, poll taxes, all sorts of issues coming up that the Senate could not act. And in light of that, it seems pretty appropriate for the Senate to try to change the rules of the game so that at least supermajorities can work their will. Right? It would be better as a legislative body if majorities could work their will, but as of yet, we have supermajority rule in the Senate.
What about the House? Why aren't they the same?
Well, the Senate early on got rid, I think by mistake, of the pivotal previous question motion, the rule they need. The House kept it, and in fact, they sort of massaged it in a way that it became an instrument of power for the majority party, and majorities realized that. So they had a rule that cut off debate, and they used it to get other rules that empower the majority party. So they'd offer, let's say we want a rule you can only talk for 5 minutes on an amendment. The majority proposes the rule, the minority tries to block it. They can't because they use the rule to cut off the debate, and that empowers majorities over the history of the House. So that today we have basically a House, majoritarian House, very strictly run by the majority party. And in the Senate we have the precise opposite, not because it was intended that way, but that's historical accident. That's how they developed.
What about that notion that the Senate is a tea saucer that's supposed to cool heat? Is there any kind of intention from the founders that the filibuster was there?
Well, the short answer to that is no. The founders knew full well the dangers of supermajority rule. Right? They had it under the Articles of Confederation. Right? The Confederation Congress couldn't act up until they replaced it with the U.S. Congress. They knew full well that supermajorities meant that minorities could take legislative bodies hostage. And so they thought, we're going to power the Senate and the House to create their own rules. But little did they know the direction the Senate was going to take.
A lot of people who think of filibuster probably think of Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Mm-hmm. I'm sure people have asked you this before. That seems like a classic thing. We don't see that on C-SPAN. Why don't we see that on C-SPAN?
Well, this is the question everybody reasonably asks. Why doesn't the majority force the minority to stand up just like Jimmy Stewart and talk all night? We call it bring out the cots, right? Why not make them filibuster? And the argument today goes, look, make Republicans filibuster, and the assumption is Republicans will be shamed, will give up, and majority will get what they want. I don't buy it for one instant, right? First of all, minority party, I don't think there's much of a cost for them if they think they're going to win, right? Their position to Republican constituencies over in healthcare and many other issues is popular in Republican constituencies. So there's probably a benefit to them talking all night. But to the majority party, there's a big cost imposed on the majority, right? If you keep the floor on filibustering for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, nothing else gets done. And majorities today have agendas. They want to use the floor to get things done, right? Even minority party senators, I think, want to use the floor at times to get things done. And if you wrap the Senate in a filibuster on all night, after night after night after night, what's going to be the end result? I think the public's going to look at it and say, what are you doing? Legislate, right? I think the costs of the majority are far too high, and I think the minority actually might think that they benefit from it. And I think that's in part what keeps Senate leaders from employing that strategy.
So in our history, there have been times when people have stood on the floor for extensive hours, right?
Absolutely, right? We always point back to Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina during the Civil Rights Act eventually became the Civil Rights Act of 1957. He was on the floor talking for over 24 hours, right? There have been some since then, 10, 12 hours by Senator D'Amato over a typewriter plant in upstate New York, right? Senators do it occasionally, and they become famous, but they're very, very few, if not non-existent today.
Saw a chart in Wikipedia entry about filibuster that has this sort of chart of filibusters going up and up and up and up and up now more than in the previous decades. Is that true?
Well, technically, it's very hard to count filibusters because often today senators just threaten and we count them as a filibuster vote, but it's hard to count. But what we can count are cloture votes. How many times has the majority leader gone to the floor, offered the motion, and tried to get to cut off debate? And when we count those, whoop, right up. Exponential increase after the 1970s, and increasingly higher, certainly in the last couple of years. So there's no doubt that leaders are trying much more often today to use cloture to cut off debate. Now, the majority will say, it's because the minority is obstructing, we have to. The minority will say, you're much too quick to the draw, right? Give us time to talk before you go slap us down with a cloture motion.